Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Amelia Phillips, and on behalf of the Avalon Chamber of Commerce, we would love to welcome you to tonight's fascinating discussion all about the energy future of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We would like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people that might be here with us today. Well, thank you all so much for coming out on a bit of a bleary old Tuesday night to this sold-out event. It's so great to see so many interesting faces here tonight to be engaged in this discussion all about our energy future and the role of renewables, gas and nuclear. All right, well, I would now like to introduce our three speakers for the evening, starting with Dr. Sophie Scomps, our federal member for Mackellar. Please join me in welcoming Sophie. I'd now like to welcome Tony Wood. Now, Tony is the Director of Energy and Climate Change Program at the Grattan Institute. He is also, he's been there since 2011 after 14 years working at the Origin Energy in senior executive roles. From 2009 to 2014, he was also the Program Director of the Clean Energy Projects at the Clinton Foundation, advising governments in the APAC region on the effective deployment of large-scale, low-emission energy technologies. In January 2018, Tony was awarded the Member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his significant service to the conservation and the environment, particularly in the areas of energy policy, climate change and sustainability. In October 2019, Tony was elected as a Fellow to the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. Wow, Tony, we have the right expert in the room tonight. What a rap sheet. How lucky are we? But wait, there's more. I'd like to welcome now Tim Buckley. Now, Tim is the Director of the Climate Energy Finance, or the CEF, which is a public interest think tank. He has 30 years of financial market experience covering the Australian, Asian and global equity markets from both a buy and a sell side perspective. Tim was the Managing Director, the Head of Equity Research at Citigroup for 17 years. Wow, you survived that. That's amazing. He's got a Bachelor of Business majoring in Accounting and Finance from UTS Sydney. Please join me in welcoming Tim Buckley. So we've got some pretty sharp minds here tonight, guys. It's going to be such a fascinating discussion. I'm going to sit down over there and, like I said, in about an hour we'll collate all your questions as well. So I'd now love to hand over to Dr. Sophie.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Thanks everyone for being here today as well, and a very warm welcome. Well, we are in the midst of a momentous transition in our energy system. It's probably the biggest change it is the biggest change since the Industrial Revolution. So we are incredibly lucky to have two of the most eminent energy experts with us tonight to help us navigate as we discuss the challenges, the benefits, and also the different options that are available to us. Before we get started, I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my deep respects to the traditional custodians of the traditional owners of this land, and thank them for caring for this country, this coastline and the waterways since time immemorial. I just wanted to add a couple of things because just about the institutes that Tony is a part of. The Grattan Institute is a public think tank established in 2008. It's independent and it's non-aligned and defines itself as contributing to public policy in Australia as a liberal democracy in a globalised economy. Also, Tony is a fellow of the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, which is also an independent non-government organisation and charity. And it brings together over 900 of Australia's leading engineers, applied scientists and technologists to create a better Australia and world. And also, Tim, as you heard, is one of our absolute expert climate and energy finance minds that everybody turns to when they want to hear about finance, the underpinnings of our energy policies. So thank you both so much for being here. I thought I might crack on and just start right at the beginning. And that really is about why are we having, and I might start with you, Tony, why are we actually having this discussion right now about our energy transition? What's happening so that we're having this discussion? What's pushing us in that direction?
I guess there's a few things that all come together in a sense. Australia has for many years been a country that has, more than most, blessed with resources that have enabled us to grow our economy. Energy underpins our modern economy, and we've had lots of it. I mean, the only one we really haven't had much of is hydro, because we don't have too many big mountains, and that's about it really. We have lots of choices. And for most of our history, that's been very successful. I think one of the reasons why we're having this debate now is there's two big things that have happened. One is that whilst fossil fuels, which we extracted, and I worked for a lot of my life in industries that absolutely use fossil fuels for energy and making other things, while we did that, we've realised that there are consequences. As there are, most things you do in life, there are consequences. And now we're having to deal with those consequences. I don't think shouldn't be a particularly dramatic thing to say, because it's just basically arithmetic and physics. And so when you look at those consequences, that means we've got to change. And you made the point, Sophie, that this is another industrial revolution. But this one is to a timetable. And that's what makes it harder, I think. And I mean, you can argue a lot about 2050 and to whatever date you like, but that's what makes this much harder in one sense. The other thing that's made it particularly timely now is that more than most countries in the world, this became political. And it didn't have to be. Energy and climate change that became political. It became a choice politically, I think. And we've never got back to the point of saying, well, why don't we have bipartisan support for this? Because when you think about Margaret Thatcher, who was not exactly the most left-wing social do-gooder you've ever heard about, she was very strong. This is a conservative matter, and she took it seriously. But yet we've not been able to get ourselves back to that territory. And I think attempts have been made, but we haven't been successful. And so we are in the middle of a transition that is fundamentally important to our very existence. Not to the planet will still be here. It's to our own existence. And if you think that you will not be affected by either climate change or what we do to address climate change, you are wrong. You haven't thought about it enough. It is going to affect us all in ways many of us haven't even thought about yet, both financially, physically, socially, and environmentally. So that's why we're having this discussion. It is important, and there are big choices ahead of us, and in some cases, forks in the road, which makes it even more interesting.
Sophie, can I maybe answer that as well in a different way? And I was just thinking about an op-ed that Guy Debelle, the ex-Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, wrote in the AFR today. And we've had this election. We're here tonight because there is a federal election when we eventually get it called. And it's supposedly going to be a cost of living election rather than a climate election. And Tony answered your question in terms of climate, and I work on climate, obviously, as well as energy and finance. They're totally related. But when you think about cost of living, when Guy Debelle, the ex-governor, deputy of the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, says, quotes the IEA, have a read of it. It's a really, well, for me, it's interesting because it's a finance perspective. But he says a third of the cost of living crisis is the result of energy price hyperinflation. A third. And so our cost of living crisis is energy related. What we have is an absolute failure to protect Australians over the long term because we have export price parity on all of our fossil fuels. So when Putin invades Ukraine, price of energy in Europe goes up 1,000-fold and the price of commodities in Australia goes up 1,000-fold. almost instantaneously because that's what global trade does. Failure to do what, say, Western Australia did, which is before they gave approval for massive world-leading LNG export facilities, they said, right, we're going to protect West Australian consumers and let the multinationals export the surplus. Obviously, the multinationals didn't like that, so when they came to gouge East Australia, they said, right, let's not have that protection, let's not have a domestic gas reservation. And so, lo and behold, all of us see our gas price go up 1,000%, the same time as Europe went up 1,000%. And so, where I really take issue with the framing from the federal LNP is that they say renewables are the cause of the hyper energy prices we're all paying. And that is just totally wrong. It's the hyperinflation of oil, gas, and coal, and the total failure by both sides, both major parties, to protect Australians. So, because we export 84% of our gas from Eastern Australia. We export 84%. There's no shortage. We'll come back to that. I know that's a specific topic, but we also export 80% of our coal, and we pay export price parity for it. And so the coal price went up 1,000%. What did our electricity price do? Went through the roof, up 300%. So Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia, massively disrupted Europe, but equally disrupted Australia because we have a failure to regulate to protect Australians from the fossil fuel industry, which is the biggest, most profitable industry in Australia. They made more money in 2023 than all of our banks put together by a factor of 2 or 3. That's how big they are. And most of them are multinationals. Most of them pay no corporate tax. Most of them pay bugger all royalties. So hence why I'm so anti-multinational fossil fuel companies. It's all about them socialise the costs and externalise the profits off to a tax haven.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks both. And we're going to drill down into a lot of what both of you said as we go on tonight as well. But there's one other thing I'd like either of you to touch on, and that's what's happening to the coal sector. What's happening with coal-powered generation in our country?
It's getting older, like most of us in the room. And as we get older, things start to fall apart a little. The cost of maintenance goes up dramatically, and that's exactly what's happening to the coal-fired power stations. I think one of the issues is we had recently is it's when the coal-fired power stations do turn off for some reason, usually because they're breaking down more frequently, and they are, that's when gas fills in the gap, and that's when the prices go up. So in 2022, we had a situation on the east coast of Australia where everything went wrong at the same time. We did have very bad weather situation in terms of wind and solar. We had flooding of coal mines. We could not get the coal to the coal-fired power stations. And we had coal-fired power stations, one of which in Queensland had a major failure technically, and gas was the one we turned to, and that was the point where the government hadn't yet even tried to intervene in that gas market. And so coal is on the way out. I mean, there are things in our lives which produce emissions which we're probably going to need for a while yet. Steel, aluminium, and other things like that. But we don't need coal. Coal is on the way out, and coal-fired power stations will shut down within the lifetime of most of the people in this room.
So I hear that 80% will be closed down by 2030 and all by 2035. Is that your... Tim, you're wincing?
Depends who the federal government is and how many band-aids, how many subsidies we're willing to do. Like the New South Wales government, all of us, Premier Minns put his hands in all of your collective pockets and your children's pockets for $450 million just for 2 years subsidy for one coal-fired power plant. He did that last year. Now, he will turn around, and I've talked to him about it, and say, I had no choice. But... okay, grid reliability, we had no choice, but because we knew that Eraring was going to reach its 40-year anniversary. We knew that 40 years ago. We have, again, failure of government policy to actually enable solutions. So when you know something is going to expire, you build capacity ahead of it turning off so that you don't have an energy crisis. But I fundamentally, again, I won't be engaging with the federal government if it's an LNP government, because I've spent plenty of time attacking Angus Taylor. But Angus Taylor talked about, and Josh Frydenberg did the same thing, he said, coal plants last for 50 years. They do not. It's actually wrong. And so their basic arithmetic was wrong. It's 40 years is the average life of a coal plant. In India, it's 25 years. In Australia, it's 40 years. And Eraring, Origin Energy, they're no bunnies. They knew they had a 40-year-old coal-fired power plant. They didn't have any coal because the coal plant was going to shut. So when they went to shut it down, they said to Matt Kean, you can have the coal plant back. He didn't want it for $1. That's what they offered it to him for. He said it's worth negative. It's worth negative because it didn't have any coal. And a coal plant without coal doesn't produce electricity, hence why we're now having to pay $450 million over 2 years to buy coal, because Origin's not a charity last time I checked. They're a for-profit. They made $1 billion profit in the last 6 months. Sorry, your ex-employer? Sorry, having dig it.
14 years with Origin Energy.
I sold all my shares ages ago, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I just realised I was giving Tony an unfair kick there. But we knew Origin didn't do anything wrong. They didn't have any coal. They said to the then Energy Minister, you want us to keep it open? You're going to have to buy us the coal. And by the way, you're going to have to pay $440 a tonne for that coal, because that's the price of thermal coal in the international markets when Putin invaded Ukraine. What were they paying for the prior 40 years? 40 Aussie dollars per tonne.
I think the point, though, that, and you've touched upon it, Tim, that's important here is that this isn't a failure of coal, it's also a failure of the way we manage the replacement of coal and across the country. And we saw what was going to happen, but unfortunately we took a view, and I think, to be fair, I think the Labor government partly did this. Renewables are cheap, just build more renewables and it'll be fine, and that technically may very well be close to accurate, but that doesn't make it happen. And we've now seen what happens if you go into communities and don't consult with them and want to build. I mean, many people think a wind farm, actually a wind tower looks pretty good. No one thinks a transmission line is particularly good. And so therefore you end up with the sort of problem we've had. They've cost a lot of money, and you can't build renewable energy in the places we now need to build it without more transmission. And it's not the renewable energy that's the challenge, it's building all that transmission. So we have ended up with this impasse Tim's talking about. And so whether you blame renewables or whether you blame coal, the real issue is a fundamental failure of integrated policy.
Thank you. And I might just ask each of you, because you've both touched on it, but electricity prices have gone up in recent years. Can you give me your 15-second summary of why prices have gone up? You have touched, you not just touched on it, you've gone into it, but maybe coming from both of you.
Gas prices in Eastern Australia, gone through the roof. Gas prices in WA are now going up. They went up 50% in the last 2 years versus 2 years ago. So at the end of the day, a gas-fired power plant uses gas. If the input to that goes through the roof and we haven't protected ourselves, like a domestic gas reservation, it might sound socialistic, but it's a public asset that we've given to multinationals, and then we're surprised those multinationals want to gouge us to maximise their profit. That's exactly why they exist. And then the other thing is coal prices went through the roof, and then, as Tony said, we didn't actually plan and build the replacement capacity before we've got a crisis. And now we've got a rolling crisis because you can't do it, because climate wars have really polarised communities. I actually disagree with Tony in terms of the transmission. I accept everything you said, but why is there so much community opposition? It's because we've got certain politicians who've weaponised renewables, and they've weaponised climate change and created, if you get more than 50 submissions on every submission, effectively the right wing has worked out what the left wing's been doing for a long time, and now they're doing it. Every renewable energy project, every transmission project in Australia, they'll put more than 50 submissions in, and therefore it just can't be approved. It goes through a long, convoluted appeal process and nothing gets built. And if you don't build replacement capacity, prices go through the roof and all of our children pay the price.
So we've got a number of challenges right now. We've got to keep the lights on. We've got to keep costs down. We need energy security so we're not vulnerable to international shocks, and at the same time we've got to reduce carbon emissions. So I'm just going to drill down on each one of those. Tony, how are we going to keep the lights on now, knowing that our coal-fired power stations are ageing and coming offline? What's happening now? Probably from looking at renewables, gas, and the option of nuclear as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing really is that so far the system has remained very reliable. We had that problem I mentioned before in 2022. Fortunately, the lights didn't go out. The costs of doing that, to buy that coal and gas that Tim was talking about, that then flowed through to our retail prices over the next 2 years, which is why many of you would have seen in 2022, 23, 23, 24, your prices went up by about 20% each time. Now, they did come down for many Australians this current financial year, and in the next couple of weeks we'll see what the regulators think should happen to our prices next time around. Reliability so far has been pretty good, actually. Now, the problem is that, and the Australian Energy Market Operator, who is fundamentally responsible for ensuring the system remains reliable, is very concerned that we're going too close to the edge too often. We have been lucky. Last June, July in Victoria, we had what was called the longest wind drought they'd ever seen in the southern part of Australia. Wind was not blowing in Victoria and not blowing in South Australia at the same time. It happens. They had a water drought in Tasmania, and we also had cold winter. Fortunately, in that particular case, those coal-fired power stations in Victoria were running, and the gas-fired power stations were running, and we scraped through on reliability. But I think one of the challenges that we have here is that people are concerned about climate change. People are concerned about the price of energy. But if the lights go out, that is the sort of thing we can't afford to happen, because that's the way we lose support for this transition. And that's why I think we are too close to the edge. A lot of things are being done, but it feels like there's a few too many band-aids holding the system together, and that's not a good place to be.
So, Tim, I'm going to ask you about, understandably, a lot of people do worry about what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. How do we address that, or how are we addressing that?
Yeah, I think the biggest theme globally in energy markets in 2025 is that every single forecast for battery energy storage systems in the world is fundamentally wrong. Absolutely wrong, and it's wrong by multiples. And so I think batteries, when you think about a battery coupled with solar, that is how you take really cheap, zero emissions energy in the middle of the day, and then you time shift it into the evening peak. That then gets around all of the MLFs, the marginal loss factors, the lack of utilisation of our grid. Like, I talk to Transgrid and they go, oh, our grid's running at 95% utilisation. And they go, yep, and they've said that publicly. And I said to them, okay, how many hours a day is it running at 95%? Oh, a good 3 or 4 hours. Well, what about the other 21 hours? A battery time shift solar. So I was just talking outside about the fact, well, how many batteries do you build per gigawatt of solar? In my view, the answer is 3 or 4, 5 times as much, because you actually want to time shift all of that solar for 5 hours into the evening peak. No one's been thinking about that. Australia installed 2 gigawatts of batteries in the whole of last year. Massive, like unbelievable. You might remember the Tesla Hornsdale battery reserve 7 years ago. That was 108 megawatts, right? We did 20 times that last year. China did 9 gigawatt hours in 1 month last month, right? There's China's speed, and then there's the rest of the world's speed, and then there's Australian speed. We've got to learn from those countries that are solving energy crises right now and doing it at the speed that climate science dictates, and that's China. They do, in solar and wind, in a week what we do in a year.
Wow. Tony, next question for you is, we hear a lot about the need for baseload power. So can you explain what baseload power is, and is it relevant to discussions, current day discussions?
Yes and no. What I mean by that is the term had been used to describe technologies that economically work best when they're just left to run and not touched. The plants weren't designed to be brought up and down in terms of availability. They were designed to run flat all the time. And that was called the base load. Now, we don't consume electricity like that. And it didn't have the storage of batteries that Tim's been talking about. Interestingly, some of you may even remember, we used to make gas this way. We used to store gas to deal with this problem. We have these big tanks called gasometers. We don't have them anymore because we don't need them for that reason. But the idea of being able to store the energy that's being made so it's available when we're using it is fundamentally important here. And that's why the storage issue for electricity, but it is actually relatively clear what needs to be done. And I think that's where the next big steps have to be made, because the issue of whether it doesn't matter what the technology is, how you match up, different technologies have different characteristics. So wind and solar are intermittent. That is not a moral criticism of wind and solar. Solar is predictable. I can tell you now that even if the human species has died out, in a million years, what time the sun will come up in Sydney on whatever date, 26th of February. That's what's going to happen right now. I don't know how cloudy it'll be, and I don't know how much PV energy you'll produce, but it is predictable in that sense. So matching up demand and supply is what this is about. And so we need the technologies that do that. Different technologies will be in part of the mix. If we had one technology that did all of that perfectly, we don't need anything else, but we don't. Different technologies are being tested, some of them which are on the fringe of development. Some things like storage, such as some of you may have seen recently, only in the last couple of days, a company's got an operation at Broken Hill. They're going to try and store energy as compressed air. There are people looking at various forms of storing energy, including a pumped hydro. So I think one of the big issues is going to be how that plays out, because I think that's where we're going to go. And baseload becomes irrelevant.
Yeah, I heard from the people who were developing that pumped air or compressed air, and they were saying that it could run Broken Hill and surrounding towns, or they're not that close, but for 10 days. So I found that fascinating. So just talking about baseload, that's an argument for nuclear. Can you talk to me about baseload power and the need for nuclear for that reason?
Thanks, Sophie. I was going to swear and mention nuclear, but before I do, to me, baseload is the question we should have been asking last century, right? The LNP wants to talk about baseload in 2025. It was an issue 25 years ago, last century. They're asking the question that they want to ask, that they want you to ask, and they're trying to solve for it because that's what nuclear is about, baseload power. Anyone here heard of the duck curve, the solar duck curve? Just hands up if you wouldn't mind. Okay, a pretty accepted standard thing. You look at the Californian solar duck curve, it's identical to the South Australian duck curve, it's identical to the Chinese duck curve. It is the definition of we have AEMO's biggest problem right now is not maximum on-grid demand, it's minimum on-grid demand, because exactly as Tony says, it's predictable the sun's going to rise every day and solar is going to generate a huge amount of really low cost, zero marginal cost energy, zero emissions, and then when the sun goes down, there will be no solar. And so you have literally on-grid demand gets gutted for the 6 or 8 hours a day of solar, predictably. And that's the key point. Baseload power means you produce power every hour of every day, 7 days a week. Doesn't matter if your industry is shut on Saturday and Sunday, you're still going to produce power. What are you going to do with it? AEMO is already worrying about minimum on-grid demand. Now, I think AEMO's failed to understand the real revolution that batteries involve, and that's the conversation we're having with them right now. Like, increased battery deployments 1,000-fold. It's in fact exactly what ARENA talked about today. They did a two-hour seminar about vehicle-to-grid charging. They're saying for all my talk about batteries, the biggest battery in Australia is going to be the collective battery on wheel, which is your electric vehicle. And that is going to transform everything. And so the idea that we need baseload power today, let alone in 20 years' time, whenever it's sunny, power will be negative priced. It already is. In Victoria, prices were negative 20% of the time last year. In South Australia, 26% of the time. You're going to lose money running a baseload nuclear power plant for 20% of the time?
Talk to me about what would happen to solar if there was nuclear. I've heard that people would have to turn off their solar or their feed-in to the grid.
Yeah, people won't get that choice. AEMO is already demanding the right to turn your solar off. Now, at the end of the day, if you're on grid, they can turn your solar off to make you use on-grid electricity, because the grid actually has to be viable. Electricity has to be balanced in the system, and if it gets out of sync, the grid collapses. Right? That is AEMO's number one challenge, as Tony was talking about, grid reliability, minimum and maximum demand. I'm a financier, not an engineer, but you talk to AEMO about managing the grid, that is their big problem. So if you put a huge amount of nuclear into our system, the Smart Energy Council has been running a comment that effectively 2/3 of everyone's solar is going to have to be turned off every time it's sunny, because they will need to actually make room for everyone to buy the nuclear power. So you're going to have to turn off your free electricity and buy on-grid nuclear. That's how stupid nuclear is. Now, I'm pretty anti-nuclear in the Australian context. I follow China. I've spent half of my time, in fact, most of my time, reading about what China's energy system is. China is all in on nuclear. And we can come back to the numbers there, but I'm not anti-nuclear. There are plenty of environmental reasons why we should be. But when you're trying to decarbonise the biggest energy system in the world, China's going all in on everything, and including nuclear. But in Australia, we've got a long, skinny grid. We've got the best solar resource in the world. We've got the highest per capita penetration of rooftop solar, and we're going to have a whole lot of batteries on wheels. We don't need baseload power. And in fact, Rio Tinto, who used to be the go-to pin-up boy for baseload power, actually the CEO last week was in the Fin Review saying, oh, we're going to buy some really big batteries to help manage the intermittent wind and solar supply into our aluminium refineries. Now, I think he was gilding the lily a bit. He will arbitrage it, but ultimately he'll use pumped hydro storage to make sure that the demand is modulated in the refinery. But 10% of our Australian electricity, is used in electricity, and they're saying batteries change everything.
Thank you. We're in a cost of living crisis, and the cost of doing business is soaring. There's a big debate about which type of energy is cheaper. How do we keep our energy bills down? It's absolutely critical. It might be something you both want to touch on briefly.
I think for many years I've been a supporter of well-regulated markets. If they're not properly regulated, then you get the sort of concerns that Tim's talking about. But I think when the privatisation happened in Victoria around the turn of this century, demonstrably it produced a good result for everybody. There's reasons about the way that the market was designed, but that's what happened, right? So I think the issue about how we keep our prices down, relative to what, is the first question. Because whatever we replace our old system with is going to cost more. Now, how much more is the really important question. So you can't compare an old coal-fired power station today with a new coal-fired power station in that sense, because they're going to cost more. Some of the numbers that have been done demonstrate very clearly, and we ran these numbers, that yes, while the cost of producing electricity at the point of generation for wind and solar is low cost, you still have to connect it, you still have to put the storage in. So within the order of accuracy, there's not that much difference, and you get the emissions reduction for free if you do it that way. The trick is, if you then compare that with replacing coal with coal, that is much more expensive. And you don't get the emissions for free because you don't get the emissions reduction at all. So that's where I think the balance needs to be put, because I think, generally speaking, where electricity prices, energy prices are today is probably about where the market would deliver even if you had an efficient market. There is a point, as Tim said, about gas. Gas is the one that sets the price all the time. The argument that if we had more gas, the prices would be lower is nonsensical, because where we have the gas at the moment is not where the people are. It is going to cost more to get that gas out of the ground and give it to where the people are. And right now, I live in Melbourne, Victoria is running out of gas, and there is no solution to that problem that yet has been implemented, which is why I'm going to spend more time with my daughter in Darwin when it gets cold.
Tim, I'm just going to ask you quickly, Which is the cheapest form of energy, or are we able to say that?
Yeah, and it wouldn't be a good debate if I didn't disagree with Tony, even though we do actually agree on 95% of things in energy land. I think the cheapest form of energy, and it will be far cheaper than what we're paying today, is self-generation of electricity, solar on your rooftop, storage in your garage, and then storage in your garage twice in your electric vehicle. And that is by far the cheapest solution, and it can reduce your energy bills by 90% or more, and it can reduce your energy bills, not your electricity bills. You get off the gas, you go 100% electricity, you get off your imported oil. I was just trying to fact check a number. I saw a number today that we import $60 billion of oil a year. If we all drive electric vehicles, we don't need to import $60 billion a year of oil. Last time I checked 5 years ago, that number was 30 billion, but of course the oil price has doubled and we use more oil. So do we need to import $60 billion a year of oil and have a massive energy security problem? Of course not. Electrify. You can then charge your car during the day. That's why 300 Australians, 302, were on ARENA's webinar talking about vehicle-to-grid charging. Where do we need to get to by 2030 and 2040 to have a really resilient, strong grid? And electric vehicles will be an absolute core part of it, just as batteries are today. Now, they're saying that won't happen till 2027 or 2030, but it'll only happen on those dates or by those dates at scale if we start planning now. So to me, the number one, the cheapest form of energy is rooftop solar and electric vehicles and batteries, and that will halve everyone's energy price. But as Allegra Spender wrote in the AFR today, we need to make sure we renew Australia for all, not just most of the people in this room, including me. We have to bring the renters along. We have to bring the strata titles, the apartment dwellers. Half of Australia is renting, or a third of Australia is renting. And so we need to actually make sure the solutions allow everyone to benefit. Otherwise, the community opposition just builds and builds because people resent solar. They should actually be rewarded for it. So to me, what I think Bowen should do is actually a solar soaker. Pick the 100,000 or 500,000 poorest Australians and give them free electricity for 4 hours every day for 8 months a year. Thank you.
I think one thing, Sophie, I just clarify, I'd add to that is that I think, we've seen big batteries, and Tim referred to those, and we've seen household batteries. Some of the more interesting work that I think is the issue of whether you call them community batteries or distribution batteries. Because again, it's this question of storage. And what's the most cost-effective way to store that? Because if you could have that storage in a situation which would do the job Tim's talking about, then you don't have to worry about, oh my God, do I have to turn my dishwasher off because the power price has gone up? You would then have stable prices for electricity. It would be the storage between you and the wholesale price, which could be going all over the place, which manages that. So I think there's some of the network companies, which have got their own commercial interest in this, of course, as they all do, are looking at this question of where's the best place to put this storage? I don't think there's really any question that the role of storage is now absolutely front and centre of how we have a system which is predominantly going to be intermittent wind and solar. Maybe in the future it'll have to be some gas, but we'll see.
So I've got a question for you, Tony, again, and it's about emissions. One of the things that is driving this transition, this energy transition, is the need to reduce our carbon emissions. When is the best time to act? Is it okay? When should we be acting on that?
1990... this is so you would start from here sort of joke, right? So, look, what I find, it's not amusing, although it's somewhat bemusing, is that governments promise things that they have no control over and can't deliver, and then they don't deliver. Sometimes they just get away with it. So the stupid debate that's going on that nuclear will be cheaper in 20 years' time, no one will know. Well, compared to what, right? So forget about that one. But the current government made an interesting commitment, and they said we're going to get to 82% renewables by 2030, because that's how we'll get to 43% emissions reduction, right? Now, put it in some simple numbers. In 2010, we had about 10% renewables, wind and solar, and a bit of hydro. I mean, there was always the snowy hydro and Tassie hydro. We're now about 40%. renewable. So we've gone since 2010, about 25 years, 15 years. My arithmetic's not very good. Haven't got a spreadsheet. We ended up gone from 10% to 40%. We've got to get to 82% by 2030. That's only 6 years away, right? 25 years away now. So that means that's a hell of a challenge. If we get to 70% renewables and 40% emissions reduction rather than 43, we should be celebrating our success, not telling everybody what a failure this government was and how they should be doomed to the fires of hell for stuffing this up. So basically, we have made significant progress. The point about the progress is that we made that big change in emissions. Remember that 2005 is the base year. So when we say 43%, we mean below what they were in 2005. From about 2005 to 2015, almost all of that came from changes in land use. Nothing else. Nothing to do with transport, not much to do with electricity generation, virtually nothing to do with heavy industry, all because of changes in land use. The problem now then became that land use went from being a net emitter to a net absorber of CO2, and that's pretty well stopped now. For the last 10 years, electricity has been doing the heavy lifting. And we have seen, for a couple of years then, when you would remember when Gillard had the carbon tax debate, half of the emissions that came down then was due to that particular policy, but they went up again. But electricity has been coming down significantly. Electricity is now 70% below where it was in 2005. It's no longer the largest source of our emissions. The biggest challenge we have really isn't just about electricity. It is also about heavy industry. It's about the parts of the transport we've already started, the small vehicle stuff, where electricity is the simple answer. Heavy vehicles, long distance transport remains a challenge. Heavy industry is a big challenge because there's some very big technology issues to be dealt with. And then you've got agriculture, which is basically burping and farting sheep and cows. There are solutions that could improve that. That's where our emissions challenge really lies. Because in some ways, the problem with electricity is more going to be about price and reliability. Emissions reduction with electricity almost looks like a no-brainer as much as EVs, in my view.
Thank you. Now, we only have let me just have a look, 15 minutes left of this discussion, so we might need to get a wriggle on because I want to leave some time for questions. But Tim, you're the finance guy. Just tell me what will happen to our insurance. A lot of people own a home. What will happen to our insurance if we leave acting on climate change till the 2040s or 2050?
We have left climate change action to the next decade, and I spent a good hour and a half fighting with my insurance company on Friday. Being argumentative, they put my renewal through without actually telling me, and so I then queried it, and I said to them, why has my insurance gone up by 19.4%? I've not had a claim, I have not moved house, I've not changed any detail because they didn't actually tell me they were renewing my insurance, and by the way, it went up 19% last year as well. Now, I'm not telling you anything that you're probably, if you have looked at your insurance, yours will have done the same thing. They said the cost of housing's gone through the roof and climate has gone through the roof. Now, I reminded them I actually live on the top of a hill. We haven't had any fires and I don't flood, and we haven't had any extreme weather events in my area, but they said, yeah, but the rest of Sydney has. Your bill's gone through the roof already, 19% annual, and we haven't even seen anything yet. When you talk to the Sharon Paranjoy, the number one actuary in Australia for the insurance and banking sector, and he says at the moment our insurance only really covers flood risk. The fire risk is about 1% of your policy. Now, I live on the Ku-ring-gai National Park. What's the fire risk of any house in Sydney? Like Los Angeles has just seen that. It's going to go through the roof. So we're all going to pay the price. It's all about socialise the costs and privatise the profits. That's what the fossil industry is about. We're all going to wear it. Worse, our children will wear it and they can't afford it. We can, they can't. And so we're just externalising that cost onto our children.
Thank you. And I might ask now, Tony, you about gas, because gas is important as we transition. How confident are you that gas will be a just a transition fuel. We've just seen that Scarborough the big gas site has been approved recently. We've got a massive, in WA there's massive gas fields that are being developed in Burrup Hub. And we also see Japan, which I think receives about 40% of our exports of gas, on selling that to Southeast Asia to create markets there. How confident are we that gas is a transition fuel only?
Well, I think the talk, when this conversation about gas being a transition fuel started to emerge, gas was cheap and solar was expensive. Neither of those is true today. And we've lost touch with, and I think both sides of politics have lost touch with, what do we think about gas? Is it our friend or is it our enemy? Because we haven't decided. And when we've got a lack of clarity, you end up with a bit of a dog's breakfast, to be honest, in terms of what we do about it. So that's why you'll see the thing called the Future Gas Strategy that the government put out only recently says gas is going to be here for many decades. Well, that cannot be possibly true if you accept the science of what we have to do. On the other hand, we're also, as I said before, running out of gas in Victoria, and we're not getting off gas fast enough to deal with that. So we are going to have to think about how we manage that transition. Because I think when gas is a bit like hydrogen in another sense, and that is we use it for different things. We do not need to use gas in our homes anymore, but moving off gas is challenging because there's costs involved. And there are lots of details that have to be thought through. Some places, the ACT is one, Victoria is trying to find a way out of this. And Victoria, by the way, is the state where this is the biggest problem because most of the gas is used for heating in homes in Victoria. So that's one reason we can get off gas pretty simply, but it will take a while because there are 5 million homes in this country that use gas. And many people have what I think is still an erroneous view that you can't cook with induction cooktop. Yes, you can. You can get yourself an electric wok and it works just fine. And you can find lots of people who demonstrate Asian cooking with a wok, an induction cooktop. The other reason we use gas is heating in our homes and our businesses. For most of that, electricity will do the job. In some cases, it's not yet clear whether you can get to the high temperatures you need for some industrial processes with gas, with what we call natural gas. Now, natural gas is the smartest marketing term anyone ever invented.
I was going to argue and say, hang on, you call it natural gas, I call it methane.
I try and call it fossil gas, but something sounds a bit pejorative, right? I mean,
it should be pejorative.
We don't call it fossil. We don't call it natural coal, and yet it comes from fundamentally the same place.
We call it clean coal. Cosplay Canavan calls it clean coal.
Don't you realise we've cleaned the coal up and we're sending it to China and it's fine, right? So I think this issue of the way we use this concept of fossil methane is problematic because there are some things which are relatively easy, but there's a lot of them. There are things which are much harder, but there's not many of them. So we use methane to make things like fertilisers and explosives. At some point, hydrogen will be the way we'll do that because we won't need as much explosives because we won't be mining as much coal in the future. But we will still remain. I think there's a role for hydrogen in that case. I don't buy the issue that we need to put gas at all in our gas pipelines. Not surprisingly, if you own a gas distribution network, this is a big deal because no one's worked out what to do about that problem. These are companies who only a few years ago were being told they had to connect consumers to the gas network. It's an interesting social and financial problem. The last one on gas, though, and I think this is the most interesting, is whether or not we're going to need gas as the backup to wind and solar and batteries. I think the argument is I think there's going to have to be a backup of some sort, as best we know it today. I don't think the answer is obvious as to what that backup will be or how much of the time we'll use it. AEMO thinks it's going to be fossil methane. I wouldn't care all that much, to be honest, because if we had the number of gas-fired power stations that they're talking about and they ran as often as they're talking about, the emissions will be 2/3 of stuff all, to be honest. There's other things we should be doing to worry about if we're worried about that last % of electricity generated. So maybe there's a role for gas, but that's what I think this whole issue of the transition fuel is nonsensical. If Australia's going to, I don't see, I mean, if the Japanese are going to continue to buy gas, I don't see any reason why we should stop them doing that. That's up to them. The international commitment to climate change should determine what happens to the Japanese and Koreans as they start to do that.
Tim, have you got a comment on what's happening with Japan and South Korea importing a lot of our gas and growing that gas market in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, Tony's comment, and I think you meant it pretty innocently. We aren't going to stop Japan and China and Korea buying gas. Right? They will choose whether or not they want a livable planet. They will choose whether or not they are going to honour their Paris Agreement. And when they decide to honour their Paris Agreement, which they are deciding, unlike a country to the east, they will get off our gas. So we are the drug pusher. And that's why I mentioned Cosplay Canavan as negatively as I possibly can, because he goes, oh, but our coal's slightly better than their coal, so therefore they should buy our coal. Well, they actually will buy coal from whoever sells it to them cheapest. It's not up to us to tell them our coal's better than Indonesia's coal. It's just the drug pushers argument. Our coal is 100% more emissions intensive than renewables, and Indonesia's coal is 100% more emissions intensive than renewables. Both are drugs that the world is addicted to. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think the fossil fuel industry and the gas industry is criminally dangerous in our country because they bribe both sides of Parliament and don't disclose any of it. Unlike every donation you get, you have to disclose everything virtually, and you do. But it also guarantees that Sophie wouldn't take any donations from a fossil fuel company.
Thanks, Tim, I won't. No, I don't.
I know you don't. And I'm at overt teal, but yeah, you got shit and shit light of our two major parties. Juice Media comment. I totally see that every time I talk to them. But yeah, gas is a fossil fuel. It's slightly less emissions intensive than coal, but it's still 100% more emissions intensive than renewables. And don't think our major trade partners aren't going to honour their Paris agreements, because that's what we're assuming they're going to do. Just because we're not going to honour our Paris agreement, America's not going to, but our trade partners, they'll actually work in their own national interests, and they're worried about energy security, or they're worried about being the world leader in every zero emissions industry of the future. That's China. And so China is going 100% faster than any other country in the world to decarbonise, because they want to dominate all of these industries. And by the way, they already do.
That's where the opportunity lies, by the way. We haven't talked about opportunity. This is not all doom and gloom, by the way.
And we're going to talk about opportunity very soon. But I'm actually going to ask you, Tony, right now about nuclear, because a lot of other countries do rely on nuclear. We haven't talked that much about it. So I was interested in hearing what the Academy's position on nuclear is. What is the future for nuclear in a country like Australia compared to what is happening in other countries?
Well, for some years now, the position that we've taken on this is we do need to have an adult conversation about nuclear. We're not having one of those yet. So why, in what circumstances might nuclear have a role to play in Australia? You know, I have a newspaper clipping in my office, I think it was 1969, and the announcement was Australia was going to build its first nuclear power station in Victoria. What happened? About then we worked out how to build really big, really cheap coal-fired power stations, and that killed. It was nothing to do with nuclear waste or radioactivity or weapons. It was pure, simple economics. So when you talk about this issue, I think it's about economics. So I think Ted O'Brien, I think he genuinely started a conversation about a technology called small modular reactors. Now I've got a 4-year-old granddaughter who is obsessed with unicorns. There are more unicorns in the world than there are small modular nuclear reactors. Don't tell my daughter I said, she gets very upset about it. So the issue is really, there's a promise here. It's a huge promise with yet not a lot of reality. There are some companies with deep pockets who are looking to try and develop small modular reactors. The promise is that you could build these things in factories instead of costing eye-watering numbers of billions of pounds, which is what they're being costing at the moment. You could turn them out in factories in their hundreds, possibly thousands. That's part of the promise, and the other one was that they'll be inherently safe. We'll see. I mean, we should be, in our view, the position we've taken on nuclear so far is Australia should play a watching game. If it turns out that life gets harder because some of the other assumptions we are all working on don't quite work out, then I've got no problem if we decided to have a role for small modular reactors if they ever exist and if they're cost effective. I've got nothing fundamentally about that concept, but there's an awful lot of things that have to happen to go right first. So this is not a problem for Australia today. We should have to play a watching game. We've got a plan A, get on with it. This is not part of plan A, and it's probably not part of plan B either.
Tim, would you like to comment on that?
I will. Who's the biggest builder of nuclear in the world? Westinghouse went bankrupt 5 years ago because nuclear bankrupted them. It then got bought out, 8 years ago, it then got bought out by Toshiba of Japan, and it bankrupted Toshiba of Japan. It then got bought out by Brookfield and China. They split it 50-50. Brookfield made a whole lot of money on the repair job. China owns Westinghouse. So the stupidity of Ted O'Brien's nuclear fantasies is that he's actually saying we should use Chinese technology as his boss is busy bashing China on the head because he's a puppet of America, right? China is the only major country in the world other than Russia. India is building nuclear. They're using it. Russian technology. It's Russian finance and Russian engineers building the Indian nuclear facilities. So China is number one in the world by a country mile, and India is number two using Russian. Why do I mention all that? Because last year China built more nuclear in 1 year than any other country's ever done in world history. They built 4 gigawatts. 4. And up until 11 months, it was 1 gigawatt. They commissioned a 3 gigawatt facility in December. So it quadrupled it to 4. Why am I stressing 4? Because China in 2024 built 277 gigawatts of solar. They built and installed 79 gigawatts of wind and 14 gigawatts of hydro. So add all of that up, that's a shitload of renewables. It is a ratio of 70-1. Now, okay, anyone who understands energy markets, a tenth of what Tony does, will then say, oh, but I've just quoted capacity, not generation. In terms of generation last year, the increase in renewable energy generation in China, the biggest electricity market in the world, versus the increase in nuclear generation was 45-1. Nuclear is a rounding error in the biggest country in the world, in the biggest builder of nuclear in the world. Do we really want to... And by the way, China employs 10,000 workers per nuclear facility. They have 10,000 workers who are trained to build each of them because they have 15 gigawatts of nuclear facilities being approved to be constructed every year. So they've got 150,000 workers. How many are there in Australia that ever built a nuclear power plant and aren't over 70 and retired? The answer is 0. So we have no workforce, we have no expertise. We'd need to use Chinese technology. And that wasn't even the answer I was going to give you. I was going to give you the CapEx cost, but I won't because I'll hog the mic otherwise.
I might ask you both a couple of quick fire questions about nuclear. Cost to taxpayers, and why will the taxpayers have to pay for it?
The taxpayers will end up, well, the consumers will end up paying for whatever it is. I mean, I think the idea that there are so many things about what's been announced by the opposition. It is not a policy. It's not... The fact we're talking about it is exactly the objective they've had.
Yep.
And I don't think we should spend much time talking about it, to be honest, because it makes... If this is a cost of living election, nuclear will make no difference, even under the most optimistic numbers that the opposition's use, to our cost of living for at least another 15 to 20 years.
Tony, can I ask you, you're a former Origin Energy executive. What's Origin's position on investing in nuclear?
I couldn't possibly comment. Look, I think that, give you a while, without trying to verbal Frank Calabria, who is a good friend of mine and was my associate for several years at Origin. Last year at a major event run by the Australian Financial Review in Sydney, Ted O'Brien talked about the role of nuclear. No one in the room from the industry took him seriously at all. I mean, they just kept doing what they're going to do, right? They're still working on Plan A. They're not being distracted by this. Now, if there was a change of government, then we might be interested to see what happens next, but I don't see any interest in nuclear from what I'd call the mainstream energy industry in this country. Any.
Tim, are you seeing the industry willing, or the private sector willing to invest in nuclear?
There is not a private company in the world that can build nuclear or build and own nuclear. Obviously, countries existing nuclear power plants, fine, they've got an exemption from the government or they've got government insurance. But the tail risk, Fukushima's tail risk, $500 billion of liability, no private company can absorb that. No private company can get insurance. So no private company in the world would build nuclear. And in fact, Hinkley Point is often quoted as just an obscene...
in the UK.
Hinkley Point C, UK, they're building a nuclear power plant. The biggest French nuclear company, EDF, was building it. They went into financial strife because they lost so much money building it. They brought the Chinese in. They brought in the biggest Chinese nuclear power company. After about 5 years, the Chinese nuclear industry company actually exited. And they said, we don't actually want to do this. The cost blowout is obscene and we don't want to get involved. They'd been bribed that if they came in and bailed EDF out, then the UK government would let them build Sizewell, I think it is, a second nuclear power plant, and they could build it outright. And the UK government's already written off, EDF's written off $1 billion last year on Hinkley Point C, but we're talking about £50 billion for one nuclear power plant, and it's 10, 20 years behind schedule. So the numbers in the frontier economics modelling is just total horseshit. Like, they have assumed numbers that have no bearing on reality in terms of the capital cost. And there was a major... Australia is not good at building major infrastructure. Right? Can you name a major infrastructure project, whether it's energy or road, that we haven't had a 50% blowout or 100%? Like today, I was just reading about, we were talking about Copperstring 2, which is a 800-kilometre grid transmission project in Queensland, and the capital cost has just doubled versus what they were thinking 3 years ago. Now, doubling's actually pretty low ball when you're building infrastructure. I'll swear again, Snowy Hydro 2.0, 700% capital cost blowout. Curry, I'll swear a third time, 300% capital cost blowout for a gas-fired power plant. So expect hundreds of % capital cost blowout relative to what frontier economics put in Ted O'Brien's fantasies. But what you aren't seeing is capital cost blowouts on batteries. They're built on time and on budget, or in fact, as a lot of the CEOs I talk to, under budget, because the price of batteries delivered to Australia is dropping 20% per annum thanks to China.
Thank you. We're going to move to questions from the audience, and as we sort of move into that, I'm going to ask one last question. Which you, Tony, mentioned, what are the opportunities for Australia? We keep hearing about the potential for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower, that green manufacturing in Australia. We don't really manufacture that much. Would you both like to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think we have, I mentioned at the very beginning, extraordinary mineral resources in this country. One of them used to be coal. It's no longer a valuable mineral resource, but we still have iron ore. We have significant percentages of the well-known resources and a number of other minerals. And some of those are critical to an electric century. We also have, in some cases, the opportunity to use renewable energy to process that. So instead of just exporting the stuff we dig out of the ground, we can add value to it. That's where the opportunity lies. Now, it will all come down to economics. Making a green iron from iron ore to make green steel is proving to be quite difficult. Look what's going on in Adelaide right now. That will not be simple. None of this will be simple, but the opportunity for Australia to build on that is very significant, which is one of the reasons why it isn't perfect, but I think the current government's Future Made in Australia fundamental policy makes sense. They've got some weird twists in there which I don't think make any sense, like making electric cars in Australia or making batteries and solar panels in Australia. But I think the idea of that makes sense. And even the current government, the opposition, when they were in government, they had support for the same sort of thing. It's difficult to do, getting good industry policy, Sophie, but I think an industry policy that is suitable for the challenges we have in the 21st century, whereas the scale and the pace that this has to be done fundamentally justifies having an industry policy that causes Australia to capture the opportunities that come from those resources.
Thank you. Tim, I know you love this. Talk to me about green iron and other things that you obviously want to talk about.
No, it's a huge... I've been working for the last 18 months on green iron and green steel, pivoted dramatically because to me it is the $100 billion, $200 billion opportunity for Australia. It's the single biggest investment opportunity for Australia. It's the single biggest economic risk for Australia if we don't actually do this. Why? Because we export $135 billion a year of iron ore. And by the way, we make a 50, 60% profit margin on every dollar of that iron ore. They pay $10 billion of royalties per annum to the WA government. They pay tens of billions of dollars of tax in corporate tax to the federal government. We make a huge amount of money on iron ore in Australia. We also export $50 billion a year of coking coal. So 2 of Australia's 3 biggest exports are the key inputs to the world's steel industry. So if we don't decarbonise the steel supply chain, our major trade partners will decarbonise. If we don't do it, that's fine, they'll go elsewhere. So I see it as the biggest risk and the single biggest opportunity. And from a climate perspective, steel globally is about 8% of world emissions. It's the second biggest decarbonisation opportunity in the world outside of electrifying everything and decarbonising electricity. Australia is number 1 in the world in iron ore and iron coking coal, 50% of the world in both world supply. So we aren't just a bit player, we are number 1 in the world, which is what's the bullshit about people talking about, it doesn't matter what Australia does, our emissions are only 1% of world emissions. It's just a red herring to distract and deceive. And oh, by the way, China's still building coal plants every week. So let's talk about something else. Well, Australia has the biggest opportunity in the world outside of electricity in steel. Last week, and I think the Albanese government did something really good. They bailed out South Australia's second biggest city. 22,000 people live in Whyalla. 1,100 workers work in the Whyalla steel mill, 4,000 indirect jobs. Half the workforce in Whyalla would have lost their jobs if a bankrupt foreign billionaire, supposed billionaire, entrepreneur is a better word, he was never a billionaire, self-proclaimed, he's an entrepreneur for all the negative that has in my mind. He stacked massive amounts of financial leverage on an industry that is operationally leveraged. That's just called suicide, and that's what happened. So fortunately, the South Australian government grew a spine, put him into bankruptcy, and they've now then convinced Chalmers and Albanese and Ed Husic, the federal government, to actually bail it out and then invest in the future. So Tony talked about decarbonising heavy industry as being hard. That is the premise that we have all worked on. I've said it many times. It's exactly what the eye is. It's really hard to do it. It's actually not that hard. It's nowhere near as hard as we've been led to believe. What they're actually going to build is an electric arc furnace in South Australia. Now, that's what Sanjeev Gupta promised to build and never did, so they're now going to go and build one. If you use an electric arc furnace and then use South Australia's 100% renewable energy, which is what they will be by the end of next year, and then you use scrap steel, you've decarbonised that steel by 90 to 95% relative to the average steel produced in the world. 95%, yet we've just used the word it's really hard to abate. You build a facility, you put scrap in it, and you put renewable energy in. That's how hard it is. And that's exactly what we're going to do in South Australia. But South Australia also has magnetite iron ore. 95% of our iron ore is hematite. That's all Western Australian. Hematite's hard to decarbonise. We've actually got a massive strategic problem. It's hard to decarbonise hematite. Magnetite is magnetic. It can be done. South Australia is going to lead the world and lead the world, absolutely, if we get the right partners structured in place. And the best partner would be a Japanese or Korean company with an Australian associate, with the government in there, strategic patient public equity. Build a DRI, direct reduced iron plant in South Australia. That could be done in the next 2 years. Put in some hydrogen maybe in 10 years' time. There's progressively decarbonise it. But you do a direct reduced iron plant, that halves the emissions of the steel supply chain, halves it. That technology has been around for 20 or 30 years. Australia has precisely 0 DRI plants. They're all being built in the Middle East. And who are they being built by? The Japanese, Koreans and the Chinese. They're diversifying away from our economy. So that's a long answer, but it's the single biggest opportunity for Australia. It's the single biggest risk for Australia. Fortunately, The Albanese government grew a spine last Friday and did the right thing and bailed out, got rid of Gupta and bailed out. It's costing us all, taxpayers, our money, but at the end of the day, as Tony said, industry policy has never been easy. Australia's a digging ship economy, but if we don't actually invest in our future, we're not going to have any industry left. We almost don't today, and in fact the frontier economics, part of why I've rubbished them so many times, they assume all of our refineries are going to shut. That's actually in the document. They're just going to shut down all of our aluminium refineries. The CEO of Rio Tinto Aluminium, you might have heard of Rio, it's sort of one of the biggest aluminium refineries in the world. They said we either decarbonise the Australian business or we shut it down by 2030. They're the two choices. Shut it down or decarbonise it. They only have 40,000 indirect jobs in that for Australia. Let's just shut it down is the LNP strategy, which is why I'm so overtly hostile to the federal LNP. I worked with the state LNP very happily in New South Wales. Obviously, Matt Keane's going to get sacked, the first thing that they will do when the LNP get in, if they get in. But yeah, it's actually critical that we invest in our own industry and that we build our domestic energy security, we build our industrial resilience, I'm a massive fan of China, but I would love to have some domestic supply capacity to protect ourselves from them as well. They respect strength, and if we just gut ourselves and bend over, they'll take advantage of us.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, let's give that a clap.
I don't think there are any children in the room, are there?
Tony, I've got a question for you from the audience. Where does the Academy stand on carbon capture and storage?
At the outset, I was introduced of having spent some time with the Clinton Foundation talking about low emission technologies. They didn't mention that they were all renewable. And we spent quite a bit of time at the Clinton Foundation looking at carbon capture and storage, partly because the view then was, and still is today, that there are areas where stopping the CO2 is difficult to do, therefore can you do something about that? One of the issues is to capture that CO2 and bury it, basically. This is basically rubbish dumping at scale. Now, we all know that we'd rather not have the rubbish in the first place, but that when you are left with the rubbish, you better find something to do with it, and that's what this is about, right? So carbon capture and storage is not a technology. It's a series of steps, all of which are simple, but they all can cost money depending on how it's done. So right now, Santos has got a project running in the centre of Australia. Apparently they've now already removed about 300,000 tonnes of CO2 and put that back where it came from, underground. There are projects around the world doing that. They tend to be very local, very specific to the circumstances of the geology, and if you've got to start doing something to transport that CO2 from where it came to where you're going to bury it, then the costs go up dramatically. So again, this comes down to the economics. I mean, I think the problem of rubbish dumping is not a great solution. We should do everything we can to avoid it. There may be some areas where this is tricky. I mean, cement and concrete is a particular area where the technologies to replace cement and concrete are still a fair way away. I mean, we know people are now building new buildings of timber, obviously specific sorts of timber, but I think there are areas where maybe we might be using carbon capture and storage. I don't think there's many of them. Every year the IEA, the International Energy Agency, argues that CCS will have a role if we're going to get to the targets we're talking about. That role just gets smaller every year. It may be that it's going to be the one that there may be some areas that are left. I am not a great fan of it, but I think there may be some situations. The other point about it is that sometimes it's called carbon capture usage and storage. And that's basically, can we do something else with the CO2? And the answer chemically, of course. I mean, nothing is technically impossible. Whether economically it makes sense is an interesting one. So people would say, well, what we could do is basically turn the CO2 back into a hydrocarbon and let it go round and round and round, right? And that's one of the arguments people are running. I'm still not convinced the economics make a lot of sense. So I think carbon capture and storage, basically, like most things, will struggle ever to be economically viable except in very specific circumstances, and we need to be very careful that we don't use it as an excuse to get off the rubbish in the first place.
Thank you. Do you have a position on that, Tim?
Of course. I heard someone say it's a joke. The joke is actually on us. Carbon capture and storage has been used as a fig leaf by the fossil fuel industry to say, don't worry, let us keep polluting. Eventually we'll clean up our own mess and we'll take responsibility for our actions. We won't externalise it onto all of you guys and worse, your children. That's a joke because they also control our government and they don't have any regulations to actually require them to do it. I mean, Chevron invested $3 billion in the biggest carbon capture and storage facility in the world by a factor of 400%. And for 7 or 8 years now, we're in our 8th year, they haven't been able to make it work. Like the biggest oil and gas company in America, second biggest, can't make it work. But the LNG facility they built right next door with the same engineers, spent $50 billion because the approval for one was tied to the other. That one works like a dream. It runs at 104, 105% of capacity each and every year. But the CCS project really struggles 30, 40% of what it was meant to do. That's a joke because then Chris Bowen then whacks them with a feather. Absolutely. I mean, of course, he's got Madeleine King, who's there, sponsored by the fossil fuel industry, by the gas industry. I'm a fan of Bowen, but Madeleine King is there she says, her own words in her maiden speech virtually, I am there to serve the resource industry, the energy industry. So I've just dumped on it. It is a joke. The joke's on us. But in America, I do actually believe CCS will work. And why do I say that? Because Exxon last year spent $4 billion in America buying a carbon dioxide pipeline business. Why would the biggest American oil and gas company spend $4 billion voluntarily? Because they had bribed Biden to put an $85 a tonne subsidy on the price of carbon for CCS. And at $85 a tonne, I would bet my house that Exxon will make that project hum. And they'll make a lovely profit on the back of US taxpayers. So CCS would work if you had a high price on carbon. Who's the biggest adversary to a price on carbon? Woodside, through their gas lobbyist, APIA. I know they've changed their name, but they've been undermining a price on carbon. The only reason CCS will work is if you have a high regulated price on carbon and you have independent monitoring, reporting and verification. But I am certain, which is where I would differ with Tony, I think it will work in America. You capture it at site, you pump it through a gas pipeline, that's exactly what Chevron's doing, and then you stick it down in your depleted reservoir. You need monitoring, reporting and verification because where I'm not certain it'll work, because no one's ever done it, you have to keep that gas down there for 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years. And Moomba is a joke. The joke's on us from Santos because Moomba is what's called a pincushion. 1,500 wells have been drilled into it, and Santos is busy pumping their 300,000 tonnes, which is about 0.001% of their emissions, into that one well, and it's just going to pop straight back up the other 1,500 wells. It's a joke. Like, that's just farce. Like, have a look on Santos's website. How much monitoring, reporting and verification do they do about their CCS? They're the #1 advocate for CCS in Australia. Zero transparency, zero reporting, no online, zero. Not even a year after the event, like political donations to the two major parties. Right, zero transparency. So it's a farce, but it will work if we had serious regulation. So I'm actually not adverse to what Woodside's doing up at Angel in the Northwest Shelf. Right, they're actually proposing to take the carbon that comes out with the methane and re-inject it down the well. If there's independent monitoring, reporting and verification, and Woodside, unlike Santos, does disclose all of that, and I actually, I'll maybe eat those words, I actually would trust if Woodside said they were going to do it and they reported on it and there was independent verification, I'd actually believe that would actually happen. Whether it'll stay there for more than 15 years and 1 day, I would not bet on that. And why do I say 15 years? Because the seaborne dumping legislation says the minute 15 years is up, the liability shifts from Woodside, oh, that's right, to all of your children. There's a loophole. permanence is the problem of CCS. So I've just eaten my words and said CCS is a bit of a joke.
I've got a question for you, Tony, and it's about green hydrogen. When do you expect green hydrogen to become a part of the energy system?
It depends what that means, I think, Sophie. I think we wrote a report about hydrogen called Hype and Hope and Hard Work. And we've been through most of the hype, I think, and we're now in the sort of hope phase. And a lot of that hope is being dashed because of the challenges. And people talk about hydrogen technologies. There are 3 important steps in the hydrogen process, as there are almost in the CCS process. One is if you want to make green hydrogen, and if you want to go and investigate the Technicolor story of hydrogen, you can find all sorts of colours of hydrogen. I'll give you a clue. It is not a colour. It is a colourless gas. So the green hydrogen is when you make it from zero emission energy. Let's call it renewables. And you need it to be, if you're going to do sensibly with it, it's got to be pretty low cost. Secondly, you've got to then be able to, so you've got the renewable energy itself. To make the hydrogen, you then have to use what's called an electrolyser, which basically splits the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. And when you use the hydrogen, you turn it back into water again, which happens when you make green iron, as the way Tim was describing before. So it's a perfect circle in a way. The trick is that the electrolysers are still pretty expensive. They're coming down in cost. And the third thing you have to do, if you're going to try and match reusing intermittent renewable energy to make the hydrogen, then you're probably going to have to store something, maybe the hydrogen, and storing hydrogen is tricky because it's a nasty molecule in the sense that it doesn't like to be constrained. It tends to escape very easily, and so it's hard to do, and transporting it is particularly hard to do if you want to do it in volume. So hydrogen is hard, it's proving to be much harder economic. Tim will talk about finance, I'll talk about economics. They're very much closely related. Fundamentally, most of what we're talking about is the economics of these things in terms of what our future looks like in terms of energy. There are lots of ideas. I mean, Tim, I'm sure, gets bombarded as much as I do. Someone's got this brilliant new thing that's going to solve the problem. Tell me what the techno-economics really look like. It's not about the technology. The technology often works beautifully, the chemistry works nicely and so forth. So I think hydrogen, chemically, it's a great solution. Chemical engineering-wise, it's challenging. The techno-economics are proving to be really hard. I am reasonably confident that it will have a role. Almost, I wouldn't call it the fuel of transition, but it will have a role in those areas where, for example, and Tim made the point, we can go from natural, where we always make hydrogen from natural gas, fossil methane, I'll correct myself, and maybe that's where hydrogen will find a role. Right now, the government has a real problem because it's about to announce possibly 3 projects of $2 billion between them of funding for hydrogen projects, and a number of those projects have already failed. Now, that's a bit, I should be very careful about that. You will have heard that Fortescue, a large resources company led by a guy who's very optimistic about hydrogen. Origin Energy walked away from a project that was looking for funding from the federal government. The Queensland government has walked away from a hydrogen project in Queensland. BP they've walked away from a hydrogen project in Western Australia. Now, have they walked away because hydrogen makes no sense? No. They've walked away because the economics today and the finance today just doesn't work yet. And so right now, the things that have to change are we've got to get better at producing low-cost renewable energy, which is where Fortescue is focusing, and we've got to think about how we deal with those other logistical chains of how we get hydrogen from where we make it to where we use it. I still remain optimistic, but I don't think it'll ever be the panacea that people were talking about 5 or 6 years ago.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions here because I can't choose between them. So we're going to finish on these 2 questions. One is, nuclear is being used internationally. Why shouldn't we use it too? And the other one is, when do we think vehicle-to-grid bidirectional charging will happen in Australia?
You go the nuclear one, I'll go the...
Look, I almost quote Bill Gates on this one. He says, look, Bill Gates, by the way, part of his broader interest is in nuclear, and the company that he's involved with is looking to build nuclear technology of a particular sort. His argument for Australia is, why would you bother? I mean, you've got better solutions that are more economically effective in terms of your renewable energy resource to even think about this. Now, I reckon I won't repeat what I said before, Soph, but I think there is possibly some conditions under which we might bother, but we do not have to bother today. And so the reason we don't need nuclear is because right now it's too expensive and we've got much better solutions for our purposes today. I think we're wasting too much time and money even talking about it.
Vehicle to grid?
Vehicle to grid. I spent a good hour and a half this morning, and then at a webinar, Arena hosted it. They've just released a strategy. It's online, it's public, and it's really detailed. It's the most up-to-date vehicle to grid study I've seen in the world. It's really worthwhile having a read if you're interested. Their answer is, look, it is going to absolutely fundamentally play a key role in transforming our energy market over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Why is it going to take that long? Because cars last on average 15 years. Within 2 or 3 years, I think 90% of all cars in Australia sold will be electric vehicles. No. I'm with you. Thank you. China was 50%. Now, they were 50% including hybrids last year. Number one car market in the world, number one producer of cars in the world, China. And 50% of their cars were new energy vehicles last year. Right. It is staggering how fast China's moving. They were 60% of the world's EV sales. BYD is now bigger than Tesla. And Tesla's going down sales-wise, but let's not get distracted by Elon. So vehicle to grid, I think AEMO's massively underestimating vehicle to grid, massively underestimating. Arena's trying to really put it front and centre because it's the value of the battery in the car. It's cheaper if you want to buy a battery today to buy an EV and then just plug it in, but you need the technology and then to actually sell it back to the grid. You can't do that. It's illegal in Australia at the moment. We need regulation change and we need technology change. But that technology change is coming, of course, because China just said by the end of this year, all cars in the whole of country of China will be vehicle to grid enabled. All cars, right? So when China does it, we can then just follow. So it's going to happen, but we need the infrastructure. China also built 4.2 million charging points last year alone. No, they've got 14 million across their country. Right? They're just obscenely huge numbers, but China's got a high population density. It's got 1.4 billion people. They've got a government that is forward-looking and doesn't have to get re-elected every 2 minutes. So they actually have a plan, and they do it, and there is no debate. That in energy is critical to actually solving this problem, which is why China is 60% of world EVs, they're 70% of all battery installs, they're 60% of all solar installs, they're 60% of all on and offshore wind installs in the world, they're 95% of the world's high voltage direct current cables in the world, that's China. They're 60, 70, 80% of the world's pumped hydro storage in the world being built. They're 60% of the world's hydro. Right, it's just they're 60% of the world's nuclear. That's one country, and America's a rounding error, and America's going isolation and pro-fossil fuels. They've just walked off the field and left the ground to China, our number one trade partner. And I haven't even answered the bloody question. Read the Arena study. It is all about vehicle to grid.
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. I feel like we could sit here all night and listen to the three of you discuss this. What an absolutely fascinating conversation. Can you please join me in thanking our three guests tonight? I do just want to wrap up and just quickly ask you guys if we want to hear more from you and we want to follow your opinions, where is the best place to find you guys? Is it LinkedIn? Do you write a blog?
Well, I still have a Twitter account, although it's X these days. I've just got myself a Blue Sky account, which I recommend. And also, I mean, all of the stuff that we publish is on the Grattan Institute website. We, like Sophie, we are absolutely clear on who funds us and where that money comes from. And every report we've written, and not just that, but also when we put out even a submission to government, they all go on our website. So you'll find all of that on the Grattan Institute website. I keep saying Origin for some reason. But yeah, on the Grattan website. And also you can follow us on those social media as well.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And what about you, Tim?
Unlike Tony, I walked away from Twitter 2 years ago. It was painful because I'd built up a huge following, but I can't stand Elon Musk. I used to love him 5 years ago. I loved Tesla. I wanted to buy a Tesla. I'm buying a BYD now. But yeah, so I walked away from Twitter. I am rabid on LinkedIn because there's a ability to link and reference everything and long word count, and I'm a bit of an analyst, so I post 2 or 3 times a day. All of our research, exactly as Tony said, online, available on our website, climateenergyfinance.org. We're 100% philanthropically funded. We have no government funding, no corporate funding. I've had corporates every day ask to get us to do work for them. I can't do it and talk in the public interest. So we are free of conflicts, and I do volunteer with all of the TEALs because they actually care about facts
And Sophie,
and our country.
Dr. Sophie, where do we go if we want to continue this conversation with you representing our community?
Look, you can follow me on socials, on the website. You can always also email the office. But I think it's a really great conversation, and I want to thank you both so much for being here, Tony Wood and Tim Buckley as well. And I just wanted to say as well, there was also an incredible report that came out from the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering at the end of last year about nuclear, which is also a really good report to have a look at as well about nuclear energy and its role going forward. But
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. Please thank our guests one more time. Good evening.